Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Theresa May will be preparing for Prime Minister's questions in about half an hour's time, and after that she'll fly to the Swiss resort of Davos for the annual gathering of the global business and political elite, including this year well-known establishment types like Donald Trump and Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. The theme is finding a shared future in a fractured world. Nope, I have no idea what that means either. So perhaps she's hoping for some tips on dealing with her cabinet, which was pretty fractured yesterday, the latest example of a challenge to her authority, thanks to her Foreign Secretary, the ever-helpful Boris Johnson. Lizzie is here to tell us about the obstacles now facing the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Andrew. And who knows, Theresa May might even get a little downtime to have some fun on the slopes. After all, she does have some good news. Figures out this morning show a fall in unemployment. However, there are quite a few tricky issues that the PM needs to navigate if she's to avoid a total wipeout. Now, we're into the second phase of the Brexit negotiations, and Mrs May will soon have to show her hand and outline her vision of the transition before we finally leave the EU. Then, of course, there's the final deal. Will we mirror the EU's rules and regulations to get full access to their single market, or break away so that we can negotiate our own trade deals? The Prime Minister has a tough course to navigate. And away from Brexit, Mrs May is also facing criticism from a number of senior backbenchers, with the likes of Nick Bowles, Grant Shapps and Nicholas Soames, all publicly bemoaning what they see as a lack of ideas and direction emanating from the government. Then there's the financial pressures on the NHS, with a constant stream of reports of hospitals struggling to cope over the winter period. One man who claims to have the answer is Boris Johnson, who was planning to demand spending an extra £100 million a week on health after we leave the EU. The Foreign Secretary was slapped down for going off-piste in yesterday's cabinet meeting. But there are rumours that Mr Johnson may be on manoeuvres. We're not quite sure whether that's downhill or not. Andrew.
Thank you for that. Let's now have a look, before we go through some of these things, with what the Brexit Secretary, David Davis, he's Robin Walker's boss, had to say in an exchange with the Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg at the Brexit Select Committee hearing a little earlier this morning.
Transition is different, because transition means that we are de facto inside the European Union for that period, and we are only actually out at the end of the transition. And that is a big shift in government policy and a big move away from the vote in June 2016.
We're no longer members, as you said, because for the reasons you cited. We don't have representation on the council, on the court and so on, although we're going to debate how we're going to manage that. I do not accept your description.
Will we accept new rules?
Now that's an area of some interest, because the time to take to put a rule into effect, regulation into effect in the European Union, the average is 22 months. The proposal we're having for the European Union members, we leave over 21 months.
Let's start on Europe, Robin Walker. It's your department, before we come on to some of the other matters that were raised there. So, if we leave in March 2019, there's going to be a transition period of perhaps up to 2 years. Throughout that 2 years, we will remain subject to the rulings of the European Court of Justice.
What we said very clearly is that we want to have access to the European market on the same terms. We think that's in the mutual interests of the UK and the EU to reach that agreement.
I'll come on to the single market. I'm asking you about the European Court of Justice. Do we remain under the jurisdiction of the ECJ for 2 years?
So the ECJ will still remain the Supreme Court over that market. And so, of course, therefore, where it rules on the rules of that market, we will have to take account of that. That is
we'll take account of one thing. We take account of rulings of the Supreme Court in the United States, but we don't follow them. Unless we want to. So let me just clarify. We will remain subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court until 2021.
If the implementation period, which we would seek to agree, would say under the same rules, under the same basis as our current membership. So yes, we would. So yes, it would. But it would be clear that we would be out of our membership of the European Union. We would be doing that for an agreed time-limited period, agreed between the two parties.
Well, you say we'd be out of it, but for most people, it would still feel like in, wouldn't it? We'd still remain a member of the customs union.
We would still continue to access the customs union on the same basis. Again, I think you've got to be careful in your definitions here, because I think if you talked to the EU, once we have left the institutions.
Right, but we would still be subject to the external tariffs of the customs union for another 2 years.
And the Prime Minister has been clear that would be the case.
And we would remain a member of the single market for another 2 years as well.
We would maintain our access to the single market on the same basis, under the same rules and regulations.
So we would have all the obligations of being in the single market, the customs union and the ECJ for another 2 years without actually any representation on the bodies that run these institutions.
So I think what we're talking about here is an implementation period to make sure that we exit with certainty and stability of how things stand, that businesses and government have time to prepare. That's what the Prime Minister set out to achieve.
But it's not implementation, is it? It's continuity. Nothing really changes, does it? If you're in the single market, you're in the customs. Do we continue with free movement of people for 2 years?
It would provide continuity for businesses. What we've said on that front is that people will be able to continue to come here to work and to live and to contribute.
Will there still be free movement?
But the UK will want to introduce a registration process so that we can prepare for our future immigration.
But during the 2-year transition period, will there still be free movement?
People will still be able to come here on the same basis, but as I say, they will then need to register so that we can prepare for our new immigration system where we do actually take control.
Mr. Macron and Mrs. Merkel, if she's still Chancellor, if they get together and introduce a transactions tax on financial dealings, something Mr. Macron's very keen about, say they introduce that in the summer of 2019, do we have to introduce that tax?
I don't think it's possible to get something that significant and that controversial through the European system in
But they've done all the work
I think
for it.
Realistically,
but if they could, would we have to implement that?
I think what we've got to be clear about is the UK has played a role and will continue to play a role right up to the point of our exit as a member state in making these decisions. These decisions typically...
My question, Minister, is if they introduce something like a transactions tax during the transition period, do we have to implement it?
I don't believe that is likely to be the case. I think we're talking about a theoretical, hypothetical
because there could be many. 2 years is a long while. You could do lots of things. Because Labour agrees with all this. You want to stay in the customs union, you want to stay in the single market, and you like the ECJ.
Well, what we find so frustrating is that Labour's been saying for a very long time that until the government gets its act together, which unfortunately it hasn't with these negotiations, we would have to, as a country, accept the reality of needing a transition period simply because we're not going to be ready. And, you know, we've been saying that for a long time. Finally, the government's caught up with that. But you've still got all this confusion.
Right, but it would seem to me the government is now doing what you want it to do.
Well, it is, but it's still confused. So we saw that in David Davis's comments when he couldn't say what this. Well, but
do you want us to stay in the customs union after the transition?
Well, we want the government to not be ruling out options like staying in a customs union.
Do you think we should stay in a customs union after the transition?
Well, we certainly want to make sure we get the benefits that we currently have. Well, it is because we recognise that if we were in the driving seat for negotiations, we'd have to be talking to those other EU 27 countries too. So there are a lot of benefits of that union. And I have to say, you know, just relating to Robin's comment about how the government's trying to keep things on an even keel during this process. I've been in the Customs Bill Committee hearing from businesses about how the government isn't taking on board the Union Customs Code, not something that people mentioned to me very often when I was campaigning in the referendum, I must say. It's decided to adopt a different process, huge disruption for business, when they could have just said, we'll continue with the existing customs code system.
On disruption for businesses, we just passed a bill through to provide certainty and continuity, the EU withdrawal bill, which Labour oppose.
No, but within the customs, because of the power grab, because the power grab that
OK, let me come on to the issue that seemed to dominate the Cabinet yesterday. We were promised by the Leave side that there would be more money for the NHS after Brexit. After breakfast would be another matter. We were promised, we know that the NHS is currently under severe financial pressure. So why not make a down payment on that promise, as Mr Johnson wanted? Why not put more money into the NHS now?
I fully support investing in the NHS. We stood on a manifesto to increase funding to the NHS, and we are delivering on that. And what we've seen is since 2010 is an increase of about £12.5 billion in the funding for the NHS. Last year we saw extra money put in for winter pressures, which was absolutely vital. I've seen the biggest investment in my hospital since it was built in the 1990s, announced last year. So I think we need to keep up that investment.
All right. Well, if you're very keen on investment, the last Labour government, from 97 to 2010, on average, in real terms, it increased NHS spending by £5 billion a year over that period, on average. On average, how much have you increased NHS spending?
We've increased it every year.
Yeah, but by how much?
Well, there's been billions more going in, as I say.
But how much?
Well, by about £2 billion a year.
Right. So £2 billion a year you've put in since 2010, on average. The last Labour government put in £5 billion.
And that was in the context of public spending overall increasing exponentially under that government, the government losing control of the country's debts and running a huge deficit.
We had a financial crisis, and you supported the measures we took after that crisis.
Spending, and
but
hold on, made a key priority.
Don't you see there the heart of the problem? That under the last Labour government, spending rose by £5 billion a year, on average. Under you, just under £2 billion a year. That's the problem, isn't it? Because the demands on the NHS are ever rising, but the rises in cash you're giving it are falling.
And I think it's also about how we invest that money, how we make sure it makes the most difference. Things like increasing the spending on mental health, which is at its highest level it's ever been, can save money elsewhere for the system. But
it is clear that your £2 billion a year isn't enough, isn't it? You just have to look at the NHS to see there may be other things you have to do. I'm not saying it's all money. There may be reforms you need to make and so on. But it is clear that your £2 billion a year, which is only 40% a year of what Labour was putting in terms of the increase, isn't enough.
Andrew, as I say, I stood on a manifesto last election which was actually offering a more substantial increase to the NHS, meeting the terms that the NHS itself had asked for than what Labour was suggesting at the time.
Yeah, but you haven't matched Labour's record. You're way behind it.
But I'm afraid we're talking in a different context. We had to pick up the pieces after the 2008-9 financial crash and the economic mess that they left.
But you've had plenty of time to do that.
What we have done consistently is to make the NHS a top priority for government spending, and we will continue to do that.
Well, except that you're still going to increase it by only about £2 billion a year.
Well, I don't recognise that, actually. I think the increase that we're seeing will take us up to about £16 billion increase.
You'll be 126 billion by, let's go to 2018-19. On real terms, you'll be 126 billion. That's 14 billion more than 2010-11 when you came to power. That, divided by 6, is less than £2 billion a year. So you're not increasing it in real terms by much at all.
We are increasing that budget each and every year, and we're also taking steps to increase the number of frontline staff in the NHS to make sure we have less dependence on the very expensive agency workers that we've seen.
10% of nursing posts are unfilled.
And we have 25%.
Nurses are leaving the NHS at a higher rate.
We have the biggest increase in nurse and medical training going on.
Nurses are leaving the NHS. Even young nurses are leaving.
And I'm sorry, I'm seeing in my local trust the number of vacancies declining, the number of positions being filled.
Well, I'm sure it's all Shangri-La in your local trust, but on average in the country it's not. Isn't this what Nick Bowles, your fellow Conservative MP, meant in your inability to rise to the challenge of the NHS when he called this government timid, lacking in ambition, and what Mr. Soames, Nicholas Soames, called dull, dull, dull? One cabinet minister said, "We are governed by visionless mediocrity." That's what your government has come to.
I don't think
visionless mediocrity.
I don't think there's anything visionless about increasing funding to the NHS, meeting the demands which the NHS itself set out for 10 billion more funding over the lifetime of this government, going ahead and raising the priority on mental health at the same time as we're increasing the national living wage.
So why are you timid and lacking in ambition, dull, 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 and visionless mediocrities?
The vision is there to deliver a success for this country, a successful outcome for Brexit, for growth of our economy, to drive up productivity, to make sure that people see an increase in their wages, for a significant increase in the national living wage, which we're going to see this April, and to deliver, as you pointed out earlier, record employment.
This is not me saying it. It's not Labour saying it. These are Conservatives saying it.
And it's always good for backbenchers to challenge the government to do more. I've got no problem with that at all. But what I would say is if you actually look at our record of delivery, we're seeing fairer funding for our our schools. We're seeing more money
going into... What have you done for the just about managing?
We've hugely increased the national living wage. We're seeing lower.
But that was done by Mr. Osborne. What's Mrs. May done for them?
But that work has continued, and we've continued to also raise the income tax threshold, making sure that people.
But that was the last government. That was Mr. Osborne.
I'm sorry. Continuing to drive these things and focusing on productivity, which Labour said for many years we couldn't turn around. We've seen the most recent figures. Productivity.
That's one quarter's figures. That's one quarter's figures.
Well, it is beginning to show real improvement, and what that means is higher wages. We want to combine that with an atmosphere in which the lowest paid are paying less tax.
Minister, we got the wage figures out this morning. They still show the wages are lacking behind prices, and that in real terms, wages are still falling.
But productivity is the absolute key to raising wages.
But you said the wages were rising.
We're seeing record employment, and we need to make sure we take the opportunity of that record employment to rise up wages and prosperity.
Would Labour increase NHS spending by £5 billion a year?
Yes, we would, and we set out exactly how we would do that in our plans actually at the general election. We said exactly where we would get the money to do that. We would also lift the pay cap, which seems to be having a massive impact on recruitment.
So that would be more than £5 billion?
Well, it would be. We said exactly how we would do that. Well, we set all of that out at the time of the initial discussions around
Just remind me, what was the main source of the £5 billion a year?
Yep, it was reversing. Well, for the £5 billion a year, it's all set out in our grey book.
What was it?
Okay, for example, reversing some of the changes, the top rate of tax that the government decided it wanted to prioritise.
That might cost you money.
Well, it could potentially, and we take that on board, and that's why we have a margin.
It certainly wouldn't raise you £5 billion.
No, but that's why we had many different funding sources, and I'm sure you've looked at our grey book. And I would just say on that issue of recruitment, Robin said that his own trust is fine. I'm really pleased to hear that. My trust is really, really struggling because we can't get enough people in, and the number one reason why they can't work in my city is because their wages aren't keeping track of costs.
OK, let's move on. This time last week, we were talking about the impact of the collapse of the construction firm, Carillion. Today, Labour is trying to force a binding vote in the Commons, which would make ministers hand over their risk assessments for the company before it went bust, hoping to prove they knew it was in trouble before handing over the contract. Well, we know Labour believes this is a watershed moment in the way the public views the use of private companies to provide public services. This week, they set out more of their thinking. Shadow Cabinet Minister John Trickett said on Monday that Labour would change the whole way procurement works within hours of taking office. He said on Twitter, which is how politicians communicate these days, let me be clear to the outsourcing firms, the party's over. A Corbyn government will reverse the presumption in favour of outsourcing. Under a Labour government, firms will only be able to bid for a public contract if it meets rules including giving full union recognition for their workforce and to comply with collective bargaining agreements, move towards a pay ratio of 20:1, meaning that the highest paid employee could earn no more than 20 times the lowest. And firms would have to agree to maintain high environmental standards and adopt best practice in equal opportunities. And let's have a look at this. Can you name any FTSE company where the boss is paid only 20 times the lowest paid?
I can't say to you that I know exactly what the ratio is now for every FTSE company. What I can say, though, is this is actually a mainstream opinion now. The Association of Accounting Technicians, for example, I saw in their recent submission to government, they were disappointed that government hadn't fulfilled its promise to look at this.
OK, well, let's take a look at how it would work then. If you wouldn't get a government contract unless the average of pay of the boss was no more than 20:1. Lockheed and British Aerospace are building our F-35 fighters for the new aircraft carriers. Neither meets the 20:1 criteria. Who would build our fighters?
Well, we think that this can actually change behaviour in the private sector. And actually, when you look at other countries that have adopted similar approaches, that's what's happened. We think that government can influence that.
So are you telling me that the boss of Lockheed would take a massive pay cut in order to continue to supply F-35 fighters?
Well, we don't think, essentially, that government should be paying, ultimately, for some of these massive pay packets. That's what lies behind this.
All right.
So if the
boss of Lockheed and British Aerospace, BAE now, it's actually bigger in America than it is here now. If these two companies say, sorry, we're not cutting executive pay, because it wouldn't just be the boss, you'd have to cut all the senior executives. We're not doing it. Who would supply the fighters?
Well, we think we need to change that business behaviour, so that's why we're
But if they don't change, who would supply them?
Well, we actually think that you can have additional innovation in many of these areas,
who's going to innovate a new F-35 fighter, which has been 15 years in development and still not yet quite ready for our carriers?
Well, we need to look at this whole system from start to end, because we're not just talking about pay ratios, we're also talking, in some cases, about export credit guarantees that have gone into the defence sector.
Yeah, but let's stick with pay ratios, because it's the one that jumps out. The NHS, Big Pharma, is a huge success story of this country. We have some of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. They supply drugs to the NHS. Indeed, they supply nearly all the drugs to the NHS. Their executives are paid way more than 20 to 1. Who would supply our drugs if they didn't change the pay ratio?
But to be fair, Labour's not saying that we want every single company in the whole country to change. We're not talking about outsourcing there.
You have said that it would be a condition of getting a public contract.
Yeah, exactly.
That the pay ratio is 20 to 1.
Yes, but a firm
who would provide the drugs?
A firm that you buy drugs from, you're not outsourcing services to, you're purchasing the drugs for them. The NHS has always done that.
Look at
that's not one of the areas. We're looking at things like cleaning, catering.
IT.
Right, yeah.
IT, which you outsource massively. Indeed, Hewlett-Packard and IBM and Capgemini, which is a French company, have been named by the Cabinet Office as part of the top 20 companies you outsource to. Hewlett-Packard is a massive American company. Who do you go to if they won't cut their American executive pay?
Well, we need to look at exactly how we would deal with multinational companies like that. But may I just say that actually on that issue of IT contracts, and this is something that I accept Labour governments weren't always perfect at either, but we have many, many problems with them at the moment. And generally, we need much more accountability for that process. And if that means potentially new firms coming in, more innovative ones that don't have that.
What British company could do what Hewlett-Packard does for the government?
Well, at the moment, we've had these massive contracts that have gone to huge firms and often which haven't delivered. We need to look at contracting differently. That might mean smaller portions of these large projects going to different firms ultimately.
Capgemini, a part of the top 20, its boss has paid a lot of money, as have most of its executives. If they say, it's not a British company, if they say, right, we just won't bid for British contracts anymore, where would you go?
Well, I would just
What's the British equivalent of Capgemini?
This point that I can't say off the top of my head, I'm sorry about that, but what I can say is I think the public are fed up with a system where taxpayers are effectively supporting very, very high pay packets through that public person. That has got to end. And government activity can change some of these issues. In fact, the Conservative government itself, Theresa May herself, was saying that she was thinking of looking at this issue of pay ratios, not just for outsourced firms,
talks about
but for the whole economy. Right, and she's left that. She hasn't done that. Just like
but I'm trying, but it's your policy. Ferrovial, big Spanish construction company, key to the Crossrail programme that's going on, could be key to the new Crossrail going from north to south. Its boss is paid £3.7 million. Unless he cuts his pay to probably, on your ratio, probably around £400,000, he couldn't bid for these contracts.
Well, we believe that there's got to be a change in that kind of pay system, and we're upfront about that. We've consistently said that.
No major international construction company would be able to bid for a British contract.
No, I don't think that's the case.
Why?
And
Who's going to cut their pay?
We think that people would cut their pay, actually, potentially.
You think the boss of Ferrovial will cut his pay to get a British contract?
Furthermore, as I said before, when we're talking about international firms, we need to look at the system so that we're focused on the national leadership and management.
Oh, so an international company could get a construction contract with the boss being paid millions, but a British company wouldn't get it?
No.
Unless the boss was not paid very much?
No, that's not what I said. I said about the leadership within the country. So we'd compare like with like, a British company potentially to the branch within the UK.
You haven't thought this idea through, have you?
We have thought it through. And actually, as I said before, the government itself was saying that it was going to be looking at these pay ratios. It's abandoned that, sadly.
But you cannot name one company that would fall in to this category. You would end up with an infrastructure programme that would be dead on arrival. There would be nobody around to do any of this because they wouldn't accept you fixing their executives' pay.
With all due respect, I think, unless we grasp this nettle of dealing with high pay at the top end, at the same time as we've seen falling wages at the bottom end, we're going to have continued public anger around this problem. Labour's trying to do something about it. We're going to use the mechanisms.
I understand that. That's why I'm questioning
to deal with that.
To see it. But I think we've gone as far as we can today. The United States experienced another government shutdown at the weekend, which means many government agencies stopped working. Thousands of federal employees were placed on temporary unpaid leave because of a disagreement over the budget in Congress. The White House released a series of photographs of President Donald Trump to show he at least was hard at work to end the shutdown. There he is in the Oval Office with his hat on. Critics of the president, of which I'm told there are many, were quick to claim that it looked perhaps a teensy bit staged. I don't think so. He's always like that. Certainly the desk looks a bit empty. That just shows how hard he's been working to clear it. He's previously been criticised for having a busy desk, so perhaps that just shows that you can't win them all. Now, sadly, the White House didn't relate who exactly the president was calling, though we understand that it was on a matter of national importance. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Hello? Hello? Ah, Mr. President, yes. I'm on air. What do you want? Oh, you want Daily Politics mug? Got no chance. I'm sorry, you just have to enter Guess the Year like everybody else. Yes, you do. Stop watching Fox and watch the BBC. Then you might get a chance of a mug. Oh, and remember, wrap up warm at Davos. It's bigly cold there. Bye. Try not to bother me again. I need to speak to the BBC switchboard. But if you, like the Donald, want to win one of these limited edition mugs, there they are. All you need to do is...